All right, so Chapter 8 is all about sampling techniques and research methods. And you've probably done some thinking about sampling as a part of your individual projects. And so sampling, has to do with how you decide on who your participants in your study are going to be. And a lot of Chapter 8 has to do with sampling terminology. So I'm going to do my best to give some definitions, although there's some excellent definitions contained within your chapter, and then also hopefully some examples so that the language of sampling is something that you can understand. Okay, so a term that you may have heard me use or read about in your chapter is population. And population just refers to the group of people that you're interested in your study. So is that population veterans who have experienced trauma during deployment? Is that population women who've experienced domestic violence? Is it Alaskans who've experienced domestic violence? Is it children under the age of 10 that have been in foster care? Who is your population that you're interested in? And within your population, you have your sample, and these are the participants that you actually collect data from. So from within your population comes your sample. And so really Chapter 8 is all about how you decide to go about collecting that sample and the decisions that you make in that process. A census is another example, and other than the national census, which you are likely aware of, it's rare to see a full census as a part of a research construct, simply because it's very difficult to obtain data from every single member of your population. And that's essentially what a census means, is rather than pulling a sample, pulling a certain number of people or participants from your population, you're actually collecting data from your entire population. And so you can see inherently how that would be expensive and difficult. And because there are good sampling methods, what we call probability sampling methods, we'll talk about here in a little bit, you're actually able to draw some pretty firm conclusions from a sample, and so it's not required that you actually do a full census to get the kind of data that you need in most situations. So another concept that's important in terms of thinking about sampling is representativeness, right? Or representative. So you're really wanting, at least in probability sampling, and we'll go over this definition in a moment, but at least when you're trying to make generalizations. So you want to be able to say, women in Alaska who experience domestic violence do this or have this. Then really what you're looking for is a sample that's representative of the population, so that you can say with a certain degree of probability that that's an experience of the entire population. And I know that's a difficult concept. Most of your studies will not be probability sampling because that's more difficult, and it's also not relevant in qualitative research because qualitative does not make generalizations about data. So for those of you doing qualitative interviews, you're not looking necessarily at a representative sample. If you were trying to get to be able to say with some assurances this is what the population looks like, then we'd be looking at a representative population. And the key way to do that is through random sampling. And then the last concept that your chapter talks about is sampling error, and this is simply a range that we can not, unless we're doing a census data, we cannot say with any specificity or with high specificity that this is the exact number. And your book gives the example, and you may see this. The political polls, I think, are the best place to see this sampling error. So they'll say Obama has a lead of 47% of the voters, plus or minus a sampling error of 3. So basically that means that from their data, that plus or minus sampling error, their number could be off either 3 higher or 3 lower. So that number of 47 could actually be 50, or it could be 44. So another important part of your sample is considering the unit of analysis. And for most of you in your studies, this will be the individual person. But in some research, it can be the family unit. It can be the neighborhood, the community, the state. So unit of analysis is important in terms of defining what your sample frame um, is and what your sample should look like. Sampling frame is another concept, and that's just a way of thinking about everyone that falls within the criteria that you've set out. So again, this is quite highly related to population, but the frame is really just every one of the units that falls within that that population. So it's the parameters around which you set your sampling recruitment. And so here are the big concepts for Chapter 8, this probability and non-probability type sampling. Probability has everything to do with being able to generalize or predict behaviors based on your sampling. So this is where random sampling becomes really important. The place that you'll see this most frequently is when you look at drug trials in the US, or things that your research may have called them randomized controlled trials. And the reason that we use these in medication is because we want to say with certainty, not just people that we talk to feel better when they take this medication, but we want to be able to say that through a structured process that this medication actually made a difference and statistically didn't cause more harm than good. And so in these instances of drug trials, they'll do what's called random sampling, random assignment. So they will randomly select participants who've agreed to be a part of the drug survey, and they'll either assign them to the control group or to the intervention group. And so this random assignment, this random selection, by chance either you wind up with the intervention or not with the intervention, allows for that ability to make generalizations. So the other type of sampling that we're going to talk about is non-probability type. And you'll see this probably in the majority of the studies that you look at, and there are a number of reasons for that. As I mentioned before, probability is not a major consideration for people who are looking at qualitative research because they're not trying to describe a population in whole. They're not trying to make those kinds of generalizations. They're trying to describe a phenomena as experienced by the group of people that they talk to. So it's a philosophical difference. Non-probability sampling is also important because it's possible. Very often it's just simply not possible to do the kind of probability sampling. Either you don't have access to the population in the way that you'd like, or you don't have the resources. And there's still a lot of good information to be gained through non-probability sampling. It's simply a limitation on how confidently you can say this describes an entire group of people. So the types of non-probability sampling that many of you are using in your studies is convenience sampling. So this is people that fit within your sampling frame that we can find. And obviously the benefits of convenience sampling are obvious in that that you have a higher participation rate, that you're able to actually access and talk to people, but there's not the random element to that. Quota is another type of non-probability sampling. This is where you go out and look for particular individuals that might meet subgroups that you're looking for. So say that you wanted to find 10 women, or 10 women under the age of 35, or 10 men over the age of 50, or 10 sets of twins, or whatever it is that you want to do. You have a quota set in mind. So you go specifically looking for those individuals that meet those quotas. Again, there's not a random assignment, a random element to the people that are. The other kind of non-probability sampling that you may have considered or are maybe using in your sampling is snowball sampling. And this is a great mechanism for expanding your access to a sampling population, a frame that you maybe have limited access to. So in snowball sampling, you identify one participant or two participants or a small group of participants that you have access to. And then when you talk with those participants, imagine you're talking to women who have been on temporary assistance and now have good paying jobs. So then you'd ask those first two women that you identify, maybe you identify them through convenience sampling. You say, do you happen to know anyone that you think might fit this and would be interested? And the two women says, oh, well, yes, I know this woman and I know that woman. And then you say, well, can you please pass on the research information? And they do, and those members participate. And then beyond that, you ask those two new participants, do you know someone? Do you know somebody? Until you gain your entire sample through the contacts of the original people that you came in contact with. And that's called snowball sampling. It's also a very commonly used type of non-probability, and in combination with convenience sampling. So in essence, why is sampling important? Sampling is important for a lot of reasons. It's important because it tells us whether or not we can take the information, the data that we collect, and are we able to apply it or not apply it to other populations, and do we need to apply it with caution? It's also important because where we draw our information from is used and reflected in our society, and so we want to be aware of that and make sure that not only that we are reaching as many people as possible in our sampling, but that we are reaching a diverse group. So many of you may have heard that uh, early on, a lot of the medication trials in the U.S., or even as recently, most of the medication trials in the United States were tested on white men. And there's some understanding, or there's developed understanding, that not all medications affect men and women the same. Not all medications affect diverse groups of people in the same way, and that if we truly want to look at the ways in which medications or interventions or anything affect a group of people, we need to ensure that we have a diverse and representative sample as much as possible. So sampling is important. The more people that you can have in your sample, the better, the more confidence that you can feel in the data conclusions. So that's always an important sort of element of research. Diversity and large sample sizes are important in your sampling frame, but also being realistic and reasonable about the resources that you have, which is what we've done in this assignment and why most of you are doing non-probability sampling, because that's what's reasonable and realistic for the time frame that we have.